This is Tom Callahan from C-Risk. In this video I'm going to talk about risk scenarios. What is a risk scenario and how to scope a risk scenario? What's a risk scenario and how do you build or scope a useful risk scenario? And when I say useful, I mean something that is measurable. We're going to look at risk in the context of information risk, technology risk, and cyber risk. The concepts I'm going to speak about are also applicable to operational risk, but this is really focused on cyber and tech risk. We're going to talk about risk in the context of the FAIR framework. FAIR is a standard, it's a methodology which allows us to model risk, analyze risk, and measure it in a quantifiable way. I guess when we talk about risk scenarios, it's important to talk about what is a risk in the first place. If you look at it from a kind of a, broadly speaking, a risk is something bad that could happen. Of course, that's not very precise, very accurate, or very measurable. From a cyber perspective, we're going to look at risk as the probability of something bad happening, and I say probability rather than possibility, measuring the impact in terms of, how bad it could be. If you look at the FAIR standard, the official FAIR definition of risk is the probable frequency and probable magnitude of future loss. So we're going to talk about loss events and how we look at loss events in the context of a risk scenario. So what is a risk scenario? A risk scenario is a way of describing a risk. It decomposes a risk into its different factors. It's a tool. It's a tool that allows us to communicate risk to a broad set of stakeholders. It's very important that it's precise in the sense that it speaks clearly about what the risk is, what the assets are, what the impact is, and in some cases, how that risk comes about. And of course, the more data we can incorporate into a risk scenario, the better quality communication we have. So we've established that we use risk scenarios as a tool to communicate and measure risk. There are many problems that exist today in the way in information security we think about risk. There are lots of terms and they're confusing. We often mix up things like vulnerabilities and threats and risks. And using a structured way of defining risk scenarios helps to solve that problem. Some examples will be that to some people a hacker is a threat, to some people malware is a risk, to other people an outage is a risk, but none of these things are actually risks. An outage is an impact, a hacker is not a risk but a threat, malware is an attack vector or a technique. So by having a methodology to define risk scenarios, we help to fix this issue of confusion around different definitions. Now, using the FAIR standard, in order to scope a risk scenario, you need three things. You start with an asset. This is the most important thing. All risk scenario activity starts with an asset. An asset is something of valuable to the organization, typically a digital asset. In addition to the asset, we have the impact. This is the bad thing that can happen to the asset. And the third thing is the threat actor. And you can also add in other information like the vector or the methodology. I mentioned an asset is something of value, so that could be an application, it could be data, it could be a business process supported by applications. A threat actor could be a hacker, but it could also be an internal threat actor. It could be an employee, it could be an employee doing something by accident, which could impact the asset. It could be a malicious employee who wants to inflict harm on the organization. Lots of different impacts according to different scenarios. But in the context of cyber, we rely on the CIA triad. So we think about impacts in terms of confidentiality, availability, and integrity. And of course, there are other impacts also, but again, we're talking about cyber risk and tech risk, so we tend to use these different impacts. Finally, we can think about the vector. Now, a vector is typically the way in which the threat actor inflicts harm upon the asset. And there can be multiple vectors in a cyber risk scenario. A good example would be phishing is an initial vector, followed by clicking on a link, which could then take credentials. And that is an example of two vectors in a risk scenario. I'm going to give you an example of using risk scenario scoping to help improve communication with an external stakeholder around cyber risk. So as a risk professional or a CISO, we often get a question like, what is the risk of a cyber attack? Now, this is a very vague, broad question. We can break this down further into what is the risk of a data breach? Now, this is a bit easier to understand because automatically we have an asset, which is the data, and a breach, which is an impact. But it's still a bit vague. So if we think about the rules of scoping, we need an asset, a threat, and an impact. We can think about what is the risk of a data breach of PII data, personal data. Now we're better defining the asset. But it's still kind of hard to measure this. So if we break it down even further again, we can introduce a more granular version of the threat actor. So what is the risk of a privileged insider breaching PII data? And you can see that as we decompose this further into variables, it becomes easier to measure it. We can even look at this further in terms of what is the risk of a privileged insider breaching data that's encrypted in a database where only 2 people have access. And now you can see we can really think about better understanding the risk. First of all, we're going from what's the risk of a breach, now we're understanding the real question is what's the risk of privileged people in my organization accidentally breaching a certain number of records. And that allows us to better think about the controls and how we can prevent this risk occurring. So I've given the example of taking a kind of a vague risk statement, breaking it down further. What I didn't mention is that there's another, I guess, important part of risk scenario scoping is that what decision is the risk scenario scope supporting in the first place. So if we go back to the example of a breach of PII data, let's think about what decisions one could make using that information. You know, a kind of a common decision around protecting confidential or sensitive data is encryption. So for example, we could think about if we need to make a decision on introducing encryption into the organization, scoping that risk scenario out to think about, okay, what is the risk of the scenario occurring without encryption versus with encryption? We can then start to use this methodology to make kind of what-if decisions. And if you're quantifying that risk in financial terms, you can also use this to support investment decisions. Okay, so to summarize this video, key points are, when you look at risk, it's super important to decompose a risk into a scenario. The FAIR methodology provides a way to think about decomposing a scenario using a set methodology. Each scenario has to always contain an asset, and this is the most important part. You also need to think about the impact, i.e. what bad things could happen to the asset and the threat agent. Optionally, you can include a vector, the way in which the threat agent acts upon the asset. Once you do this, you can use this information to think about how to introduce controls to reduce the frequency of risk, which is the frequency of the bad thing happening, but also the impact of risk. And in many cases, it's more important to focus on reducing the impact than controlling the frequency. I hope this was useful. Thank you for listening to me today. We have a series of other videos on how to use risk quantification to support business decisions. We have some videos which focus on how to better define the assets one can put into a risk scenario and how to express the output in different formats. And if you'd like further information on this topic, please check out the blog on our website. There are a series of articles which dig into some of these topics in more detail. Thank you.